countries and organizations are represented on the platform. Also, in terms of the naming conventions on the platform, the preferred naming convention is that you first start off with the organization that you represent. I see I also have not done that yet. Let me quickly do it. Start off with the organization that you represent, followed by your name, or you start off with the country that you represent, followed by your name as well. For me, it will be SADC-PF, and then my name is Mudisa Kabedi, as indicated at the bottom, at the top there. That's the naming convention that we follow on the platform, so that we are able to identify as members and participants follow the proceedings. And also, it's important for our contributions in order to identify who has taken to the platform. Can I quickly do a roll call to see if there are any? Because I see mostly the people that are on the platform currently. I see the facilitator, I see the legal drafter, I see our keynote address speaker, and just a few names that might be participants. Can I get an indication from my colleagues in the Secretariat? Are we expecting any more people to join before I hand over to the facilitator?
Yes, we are, Mr. Kabeli. We are expecting a few more people to join. Yes, maybe another 5 minutes.
All right. Maybe let me use the 5 minutes to just do a quick roll call just to check who's on the platform. We have a representation from Angola. Do we have representations from Botswana? Any organization from Botswana? Because on the platform currently, I see about 24 people. Those include interpreters as well, which means we still expecting a few more people. We have anyone from the DRC? All right, maybe because we are working on a different consultation today, normally it's usually countries. Maybe we don't really have country representations, but we probably have agency representatives and people from various bodies. Maybe let me work on that. Which bodies are represented here? Do we have anyone from okay, let me hand over to the platform people to just quickly do a brief introductions so that we can take it from there. I think that might work out better. I see someone from the APN AC has just joined us, but is still connecting with audio. Anyone who's already on the platform and would like to quickly introduce their organization and body? Oh, I see the UNAIDS is already here, represented by Mepuleng Litsie in Namibia. Do you want to do a quick introduction, ma'am?
Okay. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Puleng Litsie with UNAIDS in Namibia. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Melitsie, can we quickly sort out your framing, please? Is it possible for you to use your app and do the landscape instead of the portrait?
Okay, let me do that. I'll change the device actually.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can I ask maybe everyone who's on the platform to switch on their camera so that I can be able to establish if we are properly framed as well? Before I hand over to our facilitator who's eagerly waiting to take over. Mr. Chifunga, thank you very much. Can we work on the headspace just above you? Make sure that your head is completely in the picture. Because at the moment, your head is a little bit There we go. There need to be some room on top of your head. Mr. Kennedy Kalonzo, can we work on your head space as well? At the bottom, your head needs to be in the picture. You are cutting it a bit, yeah.
Is that okay now?
Not there. There we go.
Perfect.
Thank you very much. Mepuleng, is it possible for you to close the curtains behind you, the blinds, I think? There's a bit of a glare that's coming from behind you, and we can sort of see a silhouette of your picture there instead of your actual. Thank you. Can I get any more videos on, please? APNAC. I see that notification that Madagascar is going to be joining us. Thank you very much for that information. Any more videos, please? There we go. Madam Naidu, thank you very much. Let's work on that picture, and there we go. That's perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Kurasha. Thank you, Madam Musonda. Mepuleng, thank you very much. At least I can see you now. Thank you very much. Should we wait 2 more minutes before I hand over to the facilitator? Your guidance, Madam Musonda?
Yes, Mr. Modisa, you could go over the calendar again. I think we've had a few new people joining. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me share it again. Thank you once again. As initially indicated, the SADC Parliamentary Forum initially planned to have about 15 consultations on the SADC model law on public financial management. And of those, today we are having, I think, the 13th one. The first one was on the 8th of February, where we met with the Auditors General of the various SADC member states, and they all made their input into the draft. From the 8th, we moved on to the 15th, where we got various ministers responsible for finance, economic development, good governance and institutional reform. Also, the planning commissions were included, plus the accountants general of the various SADC member states. They were included in that consultative meeting, and the meeting went very well. We got various inputs, and our legal drafter interacted with them in terms of those inputs, and most of their contributions to the draft were considered, and amendments were made as per their input. Also on the 17th, we had the chairpersons of the various standing committees of the forum who participated and made their input as well on the draft. And then on the 22nd of February, we had various revenue authorities in the region also making their input. And then on the 24th, we also had the Auditors General making their input. And then from the 24th, we moved on to the 1st of March, where various financial intelligence units and anti-money laundering agencies made their input on the draft. And then on the 3rd, we had police representatives, especially those ones that are focusing on investigating financial crimes. They were also given an opportunity to make their inputs. And then on the 9th of March, prosecutors from the region also were given an opportunity to make their input. And then we had various civil society organizations, which were consulted on the 10th of March. They also made their input. And then on the 15th, we had various chief justices, magistrates, and other judicial officers, especially the ones that are serving on the financial tribunals. They were also given an opportunity to make input, and they made that input. And then we moved on to the 16th, where we had various relevant staff of SADC parliaments, including those that are working in the budget offices, legal drafters, and various state law officers and advisors. They participated and also made their input into the draft. And then on the 17th, we had financial lawyers who were invited through the SADC Lawyers Association. They also made an input. And then we moved on to the 22nd of March, where the Committee of Central Bank Governors of the region were given an opportunity to also make input on their feelings about the draft. And then today, we are meeting with you, representatives of the various agencies, for you to get an opportunity to make an input. As indicated, today's input is the 13th consultative meeting that we've had. And then we are going to have the 14th consultative meeting on the 5th of April with various representatives of the various academic institutions that we have in the region to also get an opportunity to make the input. And then on the 28th of April, it will be a validation meeting where a joint session of the various standing committees of the forum, including the Regional Women's Parliamentary Caucus, they'll also get an opportunity to validate, look at the draft, go through it, section by section, line by line, ensure that it meets the legal requirements before it can be approved and sent to the plenary, where it will be finally adopted as a document of the SADC Parliamentary Forum, where various member parliaments of the forum will be given an opportunity to actually adopt it or adapt it to their needs. That's the process that we've gone through so far. I think also now it's time for me to hand over to I see more people have joined. We have now about 35 people on the platform. Just as a last reminder, the session is conducted on the 3 SADC languages, which are English, French, and Portuguese. We kindly request that you choose the language of your choice at the bottom between English, French, and Portuguese, so that you are able to follow the proceedings. The session is broadcast. It's going to be recorded for later broadcast on DSTV channel 408. We request participants as they take the platform to please ensure that their videos are on. You are requested, as the norm on these platforms, to keep your audio mic off, and also only open it when you are given an opportunity to do so by the facilitator. Our facilitator for today is Mr. J. Kruse, who is from the PSAM. He's based at Rose University. There is part of the journalism and media studies department there. He's also he's a member of the working group that is responsible for putting together this model law. He's facilitating the program today. Mr. Kruse, over to you, sir. Thank you very much.
Good day. Thank you, Mr. Kabeli, for the introduction there. My thanks to the SADC Parliamentary Forum for convening this consultative meeting. As we saw from Mr. Kabeli's talk, this is a series of consultations, and this morning's involves various UN agencies, donors, IMF, World Bank, and other regional and inter-parliamentary bodies. We thank you for your attention and inputs over the course of this morning. I'll be your facilitator. Please feel free to use the chat function to pose any questions, and the reactions to raise your hand if you have any inputs to make. We will endeavor to stay on time with the agenda, and we will proceed first and foremost with a welcoming address from the Secretary General of the SADC-PF, Ms. Sekoma. We will then be followed by a keynote address by Mr. Dag Sunderland from SEDA, who is on the call already. After the keynote address, we will then receive a video clip to view, which the ICT team will stream so that we can observe that video. And thereafter, Mr. Daniel Greenberg, CB, who is the appointed legal drafter, will be given an opportunity to present and run through the model law and seek inputs from those on the Zoom meeting this morning. We will then be followed by a plenary where we can deliberate, receive inputs. Prior to then, if you'd like to note any aspects in the chat, I will be keeping an eye on that, and then we will adjourn thereafter. Our sincere thanks for your participation. I'd like to now hand over to the Secretary General of the SADC-PF, Ms. Sekoma.
Hello, good morning.
You are audible, thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Our keynote speaker, Mr. Dag Sunderland, the head of SEDA Regional SRHR team for Sub-Saharan Africa. Welcome. Our distinguished representatives from our international cooperating partners here represented today. Mr. Daniel Greenberg, our legal drafter, members of the technical working group on the public financial management model law, yourself, Director of Ceremonies, Mr. J. Cruz, our Director for Public Service Accountability Monitor at the School of Journalism and Media Studies of Rhodes University, SADC citizens following proceedings on various social media platforms, staff from national parliaments, members of the media, distinguished participants, good morning, bon dia, bonjour. Allow me to convey fraternal greetings from the SADC Parliamentary Forum and warmly welcome you to this key event organized in the margins of the development of the SADC model law on public financial management. As you've already been made aware, a series of stakeholder consultations has already taken off, which engaged various stakeholders from both government and private sector. This is part of our usual tradition that we have developed as part of developing the model laws at the SADC Parliamentary Forum. We always include our cooperating partners and donors as one of the last consultations as part of them engaging in the issues or the key thematic issues that the SADC Parliamentary Forum will be engaged in. I therefore would like to indicate that this is an important meeting. It's a validation step before we take this particular model law to the SADC Parliamentary Forum standing committees, which will meet at the end of the month in Johannesburg from the 27th of April until the 4th of May. We do so with our international cooperating partners and donors because their views are important. This is an area of interest, and it is important from the perspective of them appreciating why we develop model laws and the value of the model laws. But also, this also helps us chart the way forward after the adoption process of this legislative instrument. It is for this reason that I wish to thank those of you who are here today for making time to support this critical step in the development of the model law, which will help us reach the promised destination. I must also indicate that some of the partners present here today have been partners to the forum in this journey of the development of the model laws. You have contributed immensely, either through participating as resource persons or giving technical backstopping as experts in our various technical working groups, while others, like our key partner SEDA, have contributed financially to strengthening the capacity of the SADC Parliamentary Forum towards enabling them to develop model laws under the Sexual Reproductive Health and Rights and Governance Project. I wish to place on record our appreciation and thank you for your various input, which go a long way in making the SADC region a better and safer place. Whilst your diverse contributions have all been strategic, it is now important to look beyond the adoption stage to the domestication stage of the model law. And this is important because most of you are involved in the key thematic issues that are contained in the model law. You'd also appreciate that regional and international cooperating partners, or those that have been working with the forum, have always been considered as guardians of good governance and democracy around the world. You also implement programs and initiatives which are consonant to democratization and human rights. Furthermore, you are there to assist regions to formalize strategies such as those on sexual reproductive health and rights, governance, democracy, gender, comprehensive sexuality education, or safe abortion, to just cite a few, in view of harmonizing national responses to particular social and public health issues. Moreover, you ensure that public and private stakeholders work under a partnership matrix which favors complementarity rather than a duplication of efforts. And this has been the mainstay and focus of SEDA since they've started working with the forum as a partner. You thus act as catalyst to the development process in Southern Africa and around the world. The public financial management framework is yet another theme which constitutes a pillar for a sound democratic framework. Without a robust public financial management system, we all know that countries may fail. Countries may go insolvent, and they can be indebted towards foreign jurisdictions, which is something that I believe partnerships such as this would not love to see. The flows of money inside and outside a state can be productive, but also devastating if made without proper checks and balances. Without a public financial management framework, there can be no viable democracy, and thus there will be no rule of law, constitutionalism, proper observance of human rights, or protection of the less privileged. Allow me to also underscore that without the COVID-19 hitting the globe since the end of 2019, and finances have come under close scrutiny. Around the world, emergency procurements have been criticized for leading to wastage of public funds. And this is a matter that will concern partners here today. And the central role of Parliament in conducting appropriate checks and balances has come to the fore. It is therefore important that in looking at this public financial management and in assisting members of Parliament put this matter on the spotlight, that they are both capacitated through this public financial model law. Members of Parliament at the regional level and within national parliaments would have to be assisted to highlight deficiencies which prevail with regards to their oversight processes. When we look at the issue of public financial management, as regards how parliaments need to engage with this issue, it is a matter for international cooperating partners to look at from a perspective of looking at how can we strengthen capacity development of members of parliament, particularly with the global financial crisis hitting Southern Africa of late. We cannot give enough reasons why we need a robust public financial management, and this has been compounded recently by the rising of energy prices flowing from the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Colleagues, it was time for us to look at this normative framework together with yourselves in view of ensuring that the interests of the region and of the international community are taken on board. Today, as you engage with our legal drafter, Dr. Daniel Greenberg, I encourage you to be open with him in respect of how best we can improve on this particular model law. It is also important for you to look at this instrument as an opportunity for us to look at how we engage with partners, how we look at advocacy issues, how we engage with partners in a yearly process where they're looking at budgets, so that we can ensure that we are measuring and accelerating and boosting domestication at all levels. Dear colleagues, I'd like to say that this public financial model law also applies to international commitment statements, which relate to all treaties and covenants signed by our member states, which create international commitments, such as those under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, CEDAW, the African Charters, or the Maputo Protocol. This exercise would thus promote domestication by causing the executive to self-reflect on compliance with the Sustainable Development Goals and ratified treaties before embarking in the budget exercise. Before statements will then be abundantly debated in Parliament or prior to the adoption of the budget. This is an entry point for us to look at and see how we build capacity of the institution of Parliament and stakeholders working with parliaments. It is for this reason that civil society organizations and private stakeholders will then have an opportunity to actively monitor domestication by analyzing budget lines in the interventions that they work on. As I end, let me conclude by indicating that we expect that the brainstorming session today and the advocacy materials that we may develop after as resource could be developed in collaboration with yourselves to vulgarize the model law beyond the adoption stage. We also believe that you'll be able to look into other opportunities like guidelines, videos, and even animated cartoons in collaboration with stakeholders to disseminate the provisions of the model laws, such as those that we have done in the model law for HIV and AIDS, gender-based violence, among others. I am confident that the SADC model law on public financial management will equally attain optimum momentum to develop advocacy content with the support that you've given us previously to boost domestication initiatives in tandem with national parliaments. The SADC Parliamentary Forum staunchly believes that a robust PFM can be a game changer to resolve several social issues in Southern Africa, ranging from corruption to public health. Public financial management also accords with broader objectives, such as universal health coverage, sustainable development goals, the Agenda 2063 to cite a few. While PFM can become a driver of progressive change, it required steadfast concerted effort by all regional and international cooperating partners in order for us to leverage the executive to enhance the national agenda with regards to financial norms. Thank you for your kind listening, Director of Ceremony, and I hope that while this was a long welcome remark, it is also a catalytic process to our international cooperating partners to find the place in this process of the development and the post-adoption strategies. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General Mr. Khoma. I'd like to extend our thanks to you for your thought-provoking, welcoming remarks, and they contained a range of reminders, while also encouraging greater commitment towards the introduction of improved checks and balances, both within government, but also in Parliament and at a civil society level. I'd also like to thank you for your leadership to the technical working group and the support that you've provided. I'd like now to turn to introducing our keynote speaker for this morning's meeting. Mr. Dag Sunderland is the head of the Swedish regional SRHR team for Sub-Saharan Africa and has been in that position since 2016. The SHRH team at SADC is currently based in Zambia and South Africa and is governed by a regional mandate from the Swedish government that is rooted in the Swedish feminist foreign policy. The team's work focuses on women's, adolescents, and children's health and sexual reproductive health rights, as well as LGBTI persons, strengthened health systems for improved access to SRHR, strengthened democracy and gender equality, and greater respect for human rights. Besides funding of strategic partnerships, the team is engaged in strategic dialogue and advocacy. Mr. Sunderland joined SADC in 1989 and has been working with a focus on Africa, both bilaterally and regionally. He's accumulated a wealth of experience of the opportunities and challenges associated with political dialogue and the delivery of support contributing to development and change. He's worked at SADC headquarters and the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, as well as having more than 20 years experience in Africa. He's been posted to the likes of Angola, Mozambique, Namibia as advisor and deputy head of mission, as head of development in South Africa, and in Zambia as director for the regional SRHR team. Mr. Sunderland holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Business Administration and Economics from Uppsala University and an MBA in International Management from Royal Holloway, University of London. Thank you, Mr. Sunderland. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, bon dia, and bonjour. Buemo Sikhoma, SADC-PF Secretary General, and representatives of UN agencies, donors, IMF, World Bank, and other regional inter-parliamentary bodies. Dr. Daniel Greenberg, the legal drafter for the SADC Model Law on Public Financial Management. Members of the Technical Working Group for the SADC Model Law and Public Financial Management. Meeting facilitator, Mr. Jay Cruz, Director for Public Service Accountability Monitor at Rhodes University and also a member of the Technical Working Group. SADC citizens following proceedings on various social media platforms. Members of media and all participants. It really is an honor and a pleasure for me to be able to participate in this meeting and to join so many actors united by a shared recognition of the importance of regional integration and including public financial management in particular. The Swedish government that I represent has launched the Drive for Democracy, which means that Sweden in all contexts shall work to strengthen democracy. For SADC, in particular, democracy is key in combating poverty. Democracy, human rights, and the rule of law is the thematic area that SADC funds most. Last year, it amounted to about 23% of our total aid, and that is about $660 million US. The Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness ascribed a major role to parliaments in setting out national development strategies. The promotion of parliament as an important component of successful development cooperation was also stressed in the ACRA Action Agenda that was adopted in 2008. The regional economic communities, including the parliamentary fora or assemblies, play a crucial role in the regional integration process and in strengthening parliamentary stakeholders in their legislative, budgetary, and oversight function. Our host today, SADC-PF, has long been engaged in strengthening the participation and voice of parliamentary stakeholders, and I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge your work, while of course also acknowledging everyone here today for your contributions. Public financial management is a central element of a functioning administration, and we have seen that robust PFM systems can provide extensive and enduring benefits, including stronger institutions, reduced poverty, and greater gender equality. Unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought light on the frailty and vulnerability of many PFM systems across the SADC region, and the pandemic has reactualized the important role of parliaments in exercising checks and balances over executive actions. In parallel, public debt is rapidly increasing in many countries as we speak, which calls for the enactment of policies on the management of debt vulnerabilities. The SADC model law on public financial management has the potential to support SADC national parliaments and ensure that the public financial management is more transparent, efficient, and responsive to the needs of SADC citizens. The development of the PFM model law has reaffirmed the need for increased support for members of parliaments in their engagement in public financial management, including the mobilization of also domestic resources. I believe the model law on PFM will assist parliaments in providing input to both the budget formulation and follow-up processes in order to help ensure the executive remains accountable to its citizens and ensure that resources have been allocated according to citizens' priorities and national needs. It will also contribute to more clear and transparent mechanisms for monitoring and tracking budgets, an area that needs more political support. Importantly, the advancement and respect of human rights across SADC are highly dependent on the existence of robust checks and balances exercised through the parliamentary functions of the members of parliaments. The lack of accountability of the executive with regards to the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as other commitments provided in regional and national treaties, call for a strong parliamentary scrutiny through, amongst others, a PFM process such as budget analysis and action. We all recognize the importance that treaties and commitments do not continue to just be signed and ratified, but they also have to be implemented. Since PFM and the budget process is such a key act in which governments set the agenda into motion, the model law on PFM has the potential of assisting members of parliaments in using the budget as a live tracker to monitor the fulfillment of international commitments that advance democracy and human rights. Moreover, SADC parliamentarians need information necessary to make informed decisions and derive resources for development from within its own borders. This includes decisions on national and regional taxation policies, national pension investments, the management of extractive industries and revenue, and more. The parliaments also need support in allocating these resources so that all segments of society benefit. The model law on public financial management can help accomplish this, creating greater domestic policy ownership and greater coherence with domestic needs. In summing up, the model law on public financial management addresses many needs in SADC and will support parliamentary stakeholders in their domestic and democratic mandate in various ways. This consultation will enrich the model law by bringing together divergent views and best practices from a diversity of experts and practitioners in public financial management. I wish all participants fruitful discussions and look forward to hearing the results from all the energy and expertise gathered virtually today. Thank you, merci, obrigado.
Many thanks, Mr. Sunderland. On behalf of the SADC-PF, I extend our thanks to SEDA for the support that they have and continue to provide. Our sincere thanks also for the thought-provoking inputs there. Certainly, I think your encouragement and the positive framing that the model law can provide to equip and assist Parliament to help monitor and fulfill international commitments is really much on point. And our sincere thanks to you. I've looked at the time. We are now 10 minutes, quarter to 11. We are slightly behind schedule, but we are now going to shift to view a video clip, which will endure for 15 minutes. If I can ask colleagues from the SADC-PF's ICT team to please assist. So we'll shift over to the video now. Thank you.
This is not about a campaign against multinationals, just blankly. We would like to see clean businesses who come here, pay their taxes when they work with us. The idea of reporting all their profit in a small headquarters where there are only 2 or 3 people working there and overlooking the entire operation, which is 60-70% of it is happening in this continent, we would like that to stop.
Curtail abusive transfer pricing, for example, trade misinvoicing, for example. There's a lot of work that remains to be done.
We must indeed achieve the objective of stopping the bleeding, of retaining these resources on the continent, which are illicitly flowing out of the continent.
These scenes are not so dissimilar to one that happens every day across the African continent. A businessman goes into a bank and makes a transfer of funds to an offshore company. Little questions are asked and millions are funneled out of the country electronically in a matter of minutes to a territory where little or no tax is accrued. This scenario is also surprisingly legal. A senior government minister collaborates with a mineral company executive to stash money and profits earned illegally in a foreign bank. A woman gives $5,000 to a man in the hopes to get her whole family across the border illegally. This is a human trafficker. He deposits the money in an overseas bank where it is cleaned and legitimized. All these are examples of illicit financial flows, or IFFs. Money leaving the continent, being funneled into international, global, already developed capitals and depriving African national economies of vital liquidity and resources. The campaign to stem IFFs, or previously termed capital flight, is by no means a new phenomenon and has recently received a boost by the revelation of the Panama Papers, an unprecedented leak of over 11 million files detailing wealthy individuals and numerous multinationals exploiting secretive offshore tax regimes has elevated the issues of illicit flows to the forefront of the global agenda and media scrutiny. The establishment of the high-level panel represented a watershed and new strategy to combat the illicit flows.
All started on a Sunday in Malawi. We were preparing for the opening of the African Ministers of Finance, Planning and Economic Development Conference in 2010. The room was full. We were really surprised with the response. And those who attended, they said, no, this has to go to the ministerial proper the following day. And we had a 2 hours discussion on it. And African Ministers of Finance, in their wisdom, they said, no, this is a development issue that is too important for the continent. We cannot allow this continent, the poor part of the world, to subsidize the rich part.
I sometimes refer to it as being like a hydra with many heads. And a strange hydra, when you cut some heads, by the time you get to the 7th head, the first one has regrown. It's so dynamic, it keeps on changing shape and form. So we have to be resolved to the fact that we will always be chasing, finding out new ways of illicit financial flow and trying to deal with them. That's the first thing.
GFI analyzes illicit financial flows, not only out of Africa, but out of other parts of the world as well. We did a study of illicit money going out of Africa. We were asked by UNECA to come and discuss it. We did so. This is going back 5 or 6 years now. UNECA was frankly fascinated with our analysis that the commercial component of illicit financial flows is bigger than the corrupt component of illicit financial flows, because quite honestly the media had been for years enjoying its criticism of Africa for the amount of corrupt money that is going out. So we came along and said, yes, corruption's a problem, but the biggest part of this is commercial.
According to GFI, these are the 3 clear definitions of IFF as seen before earlier: corruption, criminal, and the commercial aspect. The estimated 50 to 80 billion US dollars that the African continent loses annually in illicit flows is about double that what the continent receives in ODA or official development assistance. Moreover, based on the methodology of the Economic Commission for Africa, abusive transfer pricing and misinvoicing, the underreporting of amounts produced and profits made are another major source of commercial illicit funds lost forever.
When we then presented our report to the African heads of state and government, they adopted the report in full, adopted the recommendations that we had made, and then decided as African heads of state and government to follow up on the implementation of what had been the recommendations, which had then been adopted as decisions of the AU summit.
There has been a confluence of forces that have really given this a boost, and also, as you know very well, the birth of this was looking for how the continent can finance itself. And one of the immediate low-hanging fruits was the issue of illicit financial flows out of Africa. So I think it's firstly therefore leadership, secondly circumstance, and thirdly the strategy brought to this by the ECA.
So it's been an exciting work, and the whole purpose is to promote African development. And how do you promote it? There has to be resources. It's resource mobilization. And in that regard, what are the obstacles to resource mobilization? And one of the obstacles is illicit financial flows from the continent.
There is really nowhere else on the continent where there is a plug-in for policy and legislative shifts that we need to make on the continent to defend our output, other than currently the high-level panel. And they're doing a tremendous job because they've gone from beyond the report and letting it gather dust in somebody's office, but also looking at the systemic work that needs to be done, work with regards to policy and policy shifts, both at the ministerial, Ministry of Finance level, as well as bringing in civil society and regional organizations to make the necessary policy shifts that we require. It's good work that they do.
Even before the Panama Papers, they have managed to elevate the issue of international financial flows, at least, or illicit financial flows from Africa, at least, into an international issue. It's a global challenge also. So they anticipated the Panama Papers. Perhaps they'll be similar in future, but already the work of the panel has already put this into the fore, has already elevated this into a global issue, a global challenge, something requiring global action.
Illicit flows have steadily increased over the years in scale and magnitude, and fundamentally undermine our ability on the continent to achieve our sustainable development goals, impede transparency, and risk further increasing inequality and poverty. The campaign to stem IFFs is now galvanized under a wider context, incorporating an array of actors from civil society, tax and governance advocates, and government and parliamentarians.
We wanted it on the global agenda. It is now on the global agenda. So there are many people who are part of this campaign to stop the continent bleeding of these resources. So it's governments, it's civil society, it's business, it's everybody.
Our role we see as bringing the interests of citizens on the table to ensure that the design of policies that will ultimately curtail illicit financial flows and ensure domestic resource mobilization are policies that are not also at the same time leading to increased inequality and having a situation where it's already the poor that are already carrying the burden that are going to suffer out of that. And for that to happen, you need to have civil society organizations in the room to create that critical mass of actors to be able to again demand that the politicians and the governments actually fulfill their commitments, honor their commitments in terms of what they said they are planning to do to curb illicit financial flows.
Firstly, do you even know that there's IFFs? And if you do, what does that mean to you as a political party? In election campaigns, in parties that are in parliament, because we just say MPs, some come from ruling parties, some from opposition. Those that are in ruling parties, how are you influencing your own ruling party in terms of IFF? But more so, because parliamentarians get a budget for constituencies, are you taking this as an issue at constituency level, where you are saying in terms of mobilization, how do I take this message and explain it to an ordinary African? I mean, Panama Papers came. For Africa, we say they came, they are gone. For most African communities, it has meant nothing. People don't even know what that is. So we are saying at APNIFT, it is your role as an MP to take this message to that lower level, because these are the people that vote and keep governments afloat. If they are not empowered to know what is going on, they are never going to hold governments accountable.
Accountability is also in need of another key building block to fight illicit flows: capacity. Capacity building of appropriate institutions across the continent is key to improving skills and enforcing financial retention.
We begin to see that capacity challenges or the lack of capacity is a critical issue for combating illicit financial flows and stopping the bleeding. In particular, one area where African countries have big problem is actually implementing the legislations and the laws that they have for money laundering and for corruption and for all kinds of activities, illegal outflow of funds. And so we're working very hard to strengthen these institutions so that they can become more effective in dealing with these issues, and they become better coordinated in terms of what they do.
A clear metric on the success of tracking illicit flows is also its subsequent retrieval. Headway has now been made in a number of countries, generating repatriation of funds and the curtailment of aggressive tax avoidance regimes.
But we need even improvements to track it better. Better accounting and international accounting standards, better capacity with customs officials, better capacity in drawing agreements and other things. I mean, even just identifying or tracking will take some effort.
Uganda recently won an international court case against a British oil company, and as a result of that case, gathered $423 million in income that they would have lost did they not have a capital gains tax policy and law in Uganda. Many African countries do not have that. And because Uganda had that law, they were able to go to international arbitration, win the case, and now have that income.
The cumulative effect of strengthening financial architecture, challenging banking secrecy, and reforming common tax orthodoxy reduces outflows and critically increases income on the continent. As the fight to stem illicit flows continues, the policy and legislative shifts being implemented by the panel will inevitably need to adapt to future innovative and more clandestine methods of outflows, preempting a drive to shift not only the legal structures, but also an overall moral offensive on IFFs and their consequences.
You know for a fact that basically everybody in the world is going to disapprove. It might be legal, but if it's immoral, and people understand what that immorality means in practical terms. But secondly, I think there's much greater commitment among governments throughout the world that where legislation doesn't exist, it must be passed. Where it exists, it must be enforced. That you need all of these agreements and benchmarks, standards and all that to ensure that you have both you can have moral motivation, please act correctly, but you must also have the law on your side to say those who don't act correctly, then the law can act against them. So that you see even the definition of what's illicit in terms of the law, as people understand the loopholes and so on, and the impact, the negative impact of these illicit flows in terms of the quality of the lives of many, many people.
So some hard-hitting remarks in that video focusing on the ill effects of illicit financial flows. Certainly the adoption of a draft model law, and where member states can act on the proposed clauses to strengthen accounting in countries and hopefully accounting across countries globally, will see greater inroads into these tendencies for illicit financial flows to not be kept on top of. So we look forward to your inputs shortly. I would like to now turn to Mr. Daniel Greenberg, who will manage the next session. Mr. Greenberg is a barrister specializing in legislation and the legislative process. He currently serves as counsel for domestic legislation in the House of Commons. He also serves as the general editor for Westlaw and Thomson Reuters. He has a law degree from the Cambridge University in England and has over 30 years experience in legislative drafting and machinery of government. He's drafted legislation in many jurisdictions, and he edits 2 legal dictionaries and an international legal journal. He's worked with governments and parliaments in the United Kingdom, Albania, Wales, the Falkland Islands, Gibraltar, Myanmar, Malaysia, Nigeria, Northern Ireland, Solomon Islands, South Georgia, Sri Lanka, to name but a few. He has extensive experience teaching as well as drafting, and he also writes on legislation and machinery of government issues. Our thanks to Mr. Greenberg for his work over the last year, and we look forward to his presentation. Mr. Greenberg.
Thank you very much. Good morning to all participants, distinguished facilitator, Her Excellency the Secretary General, and our distinguished and honourable keynote speaker this morning. greetings to all distinguished delegates, and greetings also, and particularly, if I may, to the citizenry of SADC member states who are joining us through a variety of social media mechanisms, or who will catch up afterwards in the same way. The role of the citizens was mentioned by the distinguished keynote speaker in his address a few moments ago, and I believe that we all assembled here today recognize that public financial management systems are the servant of the citizenry, and they work only with the engagement and understanding of the citizenry. I think, Mr. Facilitator, you were present at one of the consultative forums a few weeks ago when we had a video presentation of the reactions of some young citizens of different SADC member states to questions of public financial management, a slightly dry and technical topic on which one might not have expected most young persons to have particularly vehement views, but they certainly did, and their comments were penetrating and incisive, and showed that if we look to engage citizens in ownership of the public financial management system, we will not find them slow in wishing to respond with their concerns. And their concerns, which will be of particular interest to delegates, to the distinguished delegates of today's forum, revolved around fairness and transparency and equity in relation to expenditure as much as in relation to revenue systems themselves. The importance of accountably and transparently showing value to the citizenry in the expenditure of the public revenues raised. I will shortly share my screen and take distinguished delegates through one or two core features of the model law. But before I do that, I wish to make two preliminary observations. First, I remind distinguished delegates present today that legislative drafting is inevitably a question of balance. There are always conflicting desiderata in relation to any given piece of legislation that require to be balanced in a way that does the most justice to the subject matter in the context of the key target audiences for that law. And in the case of the model law on public financial management, we have had, and I say we because you, Mr. Facilitator, have, as Her Excellency the Secretary General has already alluded to, you have been an ornament of the technical working group, and that working group has been at the hub of the development of the model law, and many of its most conspicuous features owe their prominence directly to interventions and exhortations of the technical working group. So I say that we have had to balance, in particular, some very difficult competing considerations, including the need to balance simplicity with a degree of certainty. I do not need to explain to distinguished delegates today how we are dealing with an extremely technical and professionally challenging and complicated area of the law, and the level of certainty requires to be such that members of staff of the central banks, the World Bank, the United Nations, donor organizations, and all the panoply of stakeholders represented today need to be satisfied that it deals with the complexities of public financial management with a level of certainty that gives them the confidence that they require in order to be able to engage profitably. And yet, the essence of the law has to be simple as well. It has to be capable of being absorbed and applied by such a wide range of professional stakeholders that it needs to be kept simple and clear. So you have that balance which sits alongside the balance of accessibility and accuracy for the same reason and to the same extent. The language has to be plain and simple and natural, not archaic, not unnecessarily pompous, not unnecessarily technical for the sake of it, and yet it has to give the kind of accurate response at a technical professional level that will deliver the policy in an effective way. And similarly, the degree of clarity required to be achieved by the bill is matched by a pronounced requirement for flexibility. And perhaps nowhere in the draft model law is that as clear as in Part 12, which deals with crypto assets and cryptocurrencies. We could give an accurate snapshot of the position on the regulation of crypto assets today. And if we did that, we would be dooming the model law to instant obsolescence, because the way crypto assets and cryptocurrencies are being presented, used, managed, regulated, valued and understood, classified and understood today is changing beyond recognition every few weeks, never mind every few years. And distinguished delegates from banking organizations today will know more than I do about the agility and volatility of the regulatory systems in relation to the challenges posed by crypto assets. For that reason, we have based Part 12 itself at the, this was discussed directly with the technical working group. We have based it upon the regulatory principles drawn from the London School of Economics and Political Science Institute of Global Affairs, Basic Principles for Regulating Crypto Assets, 4th draft. But we have at the same time built in to those regulatory principles in relation to engagement, classification, consumer protection, investor protection, cryptographic engagement, technological application, and constancy. We have built in the flexibility through the regulation making system and in other ways to ensure that the Part 12 principles will grow and adapt to the developing challenges of the emerging usage of crypto assets around the world. And of course, I mentioned today in particular the fact that as we stand, central issue cryptocurrency remains a clear possibility, which, whether or not it is taken up by individual SADC member states, looks certain to be taken up by some states in the world, which will inevitably have an impact of a secondary nature on all states dealing with international monetary conventions. My second preliminary remark relates to contextualization. I see that a distinguished delegate has placed in the chat bar reference to the importance of standardization, with which I respectfully concur. but standardization across a diverse collection of member states, each with their own unique constitutional and legislative arrangements, needs to bear in mind, alongside standardization, the importance of contextualization as a core part of the domestication and transposition process. And it is for that reason, Mr. Facilitator, that delegates will see a number of footnotes in the draft model law drawing attention to specific contextualization requirements. But beyond that, every transposing and domesticating jurisdiction will have to ask itself whether there are other aspects in respect of which the law requires adaptation to avoid duplication and conflict. With those preliminary remarks, I move to a brief adumbration of some core concepts within the model law, for which purpose I will share my screen. And I would ask the Secretariat to confirm that my screen can now be seen. Yes, thank you.
Yes, Dr. Greenberg, we can see your screen.
Thank you very much. I draw distinguished delegates' attention first to Part 2 of the Act, which deals with the aims and objectives and articulates them at the level of operative provisions of the law. These are not merely in the preamble, though they are found there too. These are purposive operative provisions that the courts will apply in flavouring the later obligations and other provisions of the model law. And they include accountability, transparency, independence, and modernity through efficiency and effective processes for raising revenue, spending revenue, including resources generally, accounting, and oversight. Clause 10 articulates the outcomes required in relation to optimization of revenue and expenditure, sustainability, and parliamentary accountability and oversight. And it requires the executive to institute and operate a scheme for measurable benchmarks for testing success in achieving those outcomes. Again, the young persons whom we heard in the consultative forum a few weeks ago wanted ways to be sure that they could have confidence that the objectives specified by politicians for the public financial management system were actually being delivered on the ground. And it is that measurability of the benchmarks that will be key to confidence for stakeholders, including, of course, the professional stakeholders represented by distinguished delegates today, but extending throughout and including the citizen stakeholder. Clause 11 articulates the public financial management principles, including transparency, accountability, participation, oversight, and responsibility. And the responsibility principle inevitably links to the enforcement mechanisms at the end of the bill, to which I will return shortly. The video clip that we heard a few moments ago referenced in particular the moral sense of individual actors within the political sphere. And it is, of course, to that moral sense and sense of judgment that one appeals. However, it is essential for them and others, including funding, donor stakeholders and others, to know that where there are lapses in that personal responsibility, it can be enforced through effective mechanisms, including the criminal law and other mechanisms to which I will return. Clause 12 identifies the public financial management values of integrity, independence, impartiality, equity, professionalism and accountability and responsiveness, and again provides an enforceable administrative law duty for all public authorities exercising functions in this sphere to aim to demonstrate those values. And as I say, this is not mere aspirational rhetoric, it is an enforceable administrative law duty. Clause 13 draws attention to the contextualization need to which I referred a moment ago. Part 3 identifies the core authorities responsible for the public financial mechanism system, from the Minister and the Finance Secretary as the permanent head of the the civil service, the financial civil service, including the functions of the Finance Secretary, through inspection functions, and through into the ministry itself with its separate functions, articulated again at a level which aims to balance accuracy and certainty with a simplicity and clarity. The role of accounting officers as the core, as carrying the core responsibility burden is recognized in clauses 21 and 22, where the functions are set out in some detail. The Auditor General provisions are merely a signpost in Part 3 and are picked up later in the model law. Part 4 deals with public funds and will be familiar to distinguished delegates. I mention only that under other accounts, retention accounts, trading accounts, and debt servicing account, we were asked at an earlier consultative forum to say more about special funds, and we are intending to do precisely that. Also, I should say to distinguished delegates today, we were asked to say more about the particular treatment in relation to accountancy of donor funds, which will obviously be of particular interest to distinguished delegates today. And we are proposing that when the law comes back for ratification and adoption, it will indeed include references in a number of places to the possibility of special arrangements for accounting and managing donor funds in accordance with conditions of international conventions or agreements. Part 5 deals with the supply and appropriation system in ordinary terms, and Part 6 deals at some length with parliamentary control underneath the parliamentary engagement principle envelope, which again speaks to the balance between standardization and contextualization. It emphasizes the need for each legislature to use its own range of mechanisms, and while we set out what those might be, the aim is always that that should be applied in accordance with the processes and orders of each legislature. The arrangements for the Auditor General are dealt with at clauses 36 onwards. I draw to the attention of distinguished delegates that at an earlier consultative forum, we were asked to further accentuate the status of the Auditor General as accountable to Parliament and independent of government by removing powers for ministers to make even administrative regulation in relation to the Auditor General, and we have done that for the draft that will be presented for confirmation in due course, and the regulations pending more creative solutions by earlier delegates, which I have yet to receive. I have made interim arrangements for those regulatory matters to be dealt with by the Auditor General themselves. The National Audit Office is mentioned in the same part, and the functions of the Auditor General assisted by the National Audit Office are articulated in clause 41 in a general form and are then expounded in later clauses along usual lines. Public Accounts Committee's role is stressed as being the core conduit between the Auditor General and the parliamentary control mechanisms, subject always to localization and contextualization. The Public Accounts Committee is required by the model law to operate a system of effective complaints portal management so that members of the public can feel they have a real voice in relation to irregularities or enhancements in relation to the public financial management system. And that goes hand in hand, of course, as I do not need to explain to distinguished delegates, with the whistleblowing provisions, which are at the heart of an effective enforcement of any public financial management regime, because, of course, complaints and irregularities are very often known only to people who would require whistleblowing protection in order to bring them to the attention of those who are able to act. Part 7 deals with the national budget in the ordinary way, including arrangements for control and appropriation. Again, flexibility and certainty requires to be enacted in this part of the model law in particular. You have to have virement. You cannot not have virement without burdening parliaments with minutiae of detail that would not be a good use of their supervisory jurisdiction. And yet virement has the potential completely to undermine the entire controls of the budgetary system if it is used outside the envelope of a regulatory oversight. So the model law acknowledges the necessity of the authorization of virement, but within the envelope that maintains the supervisory principles and does not allow them to be overly diluted. The budget process is discussed in normal terms, including the estimate and debate. Again, at an earlier consultative forum, I was asked to draw specific attention to the possibilities in particular parliaments of providing for amendment of estimates and amendments of the bill during the budget debate. And that will be accommodated, again, in a way that acknowledges the principle without appearing to prescribe to any particular jurisdiction how it should make arrangements for it. There is considerable detail about the documentation to accompany the budget, and this will be of particular importance for distinguished delegates today, as well as the departmental objective reports. There is a requirement for a sustainable fiscal policy statement, a sustainable development goal statement, an international commitment and project statement, as well as equality and diversity statements to reassure citizens that equality and diversity are at the heart of public financial management, and again to match the flexibility with certainty, the past year and future year implication statement, the multi-year budget projection, the in-year developments of national adjustment budgets and in-year budget reports, again allowing flexibility but always within the envelope of stability and oversight. And the same for delays and variations. Part 8 deals with government borrowing. It tries to classify it in the broadest possible terms so as to include everything that has the ability to impose a liability, actual or contingent, upon the state. Again, the emphasis is on the mechanism rather than on being prescriptive as to result. The debt management strategy, which has to be laid alongside the budget, the debt management committees, which have to work to control each jurisdiction's system, and the borrowing arrangements sitting with the broadest possible definitions of government issues through agents, and of course other borrowing, including on-lending and guarantees and indemnities, the very breadth of which I know are a concern to distinguished delegates, and therefore that breadth needs to be acknowledged and articulated and brought within the oversight and control envelope. The public debt statements required to be laid as a budget document are to be accompanied by a public debt schedule to give transparency and accountability to the overall system. That was a very enjoyable sound effect of somebody opening and leaving the room I shall take it as not being a theoretical delegate walking out in disgust. Perhaps it was a theoretical delegate entering the room in excited anticipation. The debt ceiling is articulated in clause 84, again, by way not of prescription of the substantive result in a state, but by way of triggering enhanced scrutiny by way of excess reports and Parliamentary Accounts Committee scrutiny where the threshold is reached, and the debt servicing accounts and unauthorized borrowing are again brought within the scrutiny envelope. Part 9 deals with procurement and use of public resources, using the broadest understanding of the term of resources, and again with a flexibility for emergency that does not dilute or undermine the regulatory control of the procurement system. Part 10 deals with public accounting within accounting principles, also within a resource accounts approach. I do not need to explain to distinguished delegates today how resource accounting as an international standard, as it has by now replaced any form of solely cash accounting, and it is the resource accounting that is designed to give a truly fair and accurate view of the state of a public finances arrangements. The standard arrangements of scrutiny leading to the preparation of a whole of government account approach, again to give an overarching true and fair view to be acknowledged by the Auditor General. Information always being core to the preparation of effective audits, information provisions are included. Part 11, I referred to earlier as essential for effective enforcement. In cases of misconduct, misuse, or maladministration, public officials in the broadest sense must know that they can be held accountable for their actions or inactions. An offence of public financial misconduct and an offence of misuse of public funds, in each case coupled with local penalties to be drawn coherently and proportionately within the criminal and penal policy of each jurisdiction. Broader issues of maladministration are not linked to a separate offence for reasons of separation of powers, but do link to possibilities of reporting and disqualification in accordance with the parliamentary system. Part 12, cryptocurrency, I have referred to earlier, and I will now, having overrun my time by 1 minute, I will beg indulgence for about another 30 seconds simply to direct distinguished delegates' attention in the final provisions to, again, the flexibility offered by supplementary regulations and by guidance, the issue of quasi-legislation, memorandums of understanding, the guidance and codes that are so key to the effective working of most international arrangements in particular, but always subject to the oversight and scrutiny of the Parliament in each jurisdiction to ensure accountability and transparency. Mr. Facilitator, I hope that gives distinguished delegates an outline of some of the core components for their consideration today. I look forward to hearing their observations and receiving detailed submissions in writing, and I thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Mr. Greenberg, for that run through the various provisions of the model law. I can appreciate that some of the colleagues on the call, the meeting today, may not have gone through the model law in its current draft, letter by letter, provision by provision. So we do welcome written inputs and suggestions on various clauses. Now is an opportunity to put your hand up, pose any questions. If you prefer to place it in the chat, that is also permissible. We did have a question, I think it is Honourable MP Kennedy Kalonzo posed a question in the chat quite a bit earlier on. He posed the question as follows: most partner states have their own PFM Act. How will this model law interact with the national ones? I did see a response kindly put in the chat by the Honourable Secretary General, which colleagues can consider there. If Mr. Greenberg wanted to make any additional inputs, if he would like to, on that question of how would it interact with national ones, if I may. But whilst he responds to that, please feel free to use the chat or raise your hand and I'll keep an eye out. Thank you.
Yeah, simply to say that is, of course, a particular contextualization issue for the domestication process in each state. We've had a number of observations by participants in earlier sessions of the forums, identifying particular gaps in their own public financial management systems and legislation. The model law, of course, was based on a combination of an appraisal of existing systems in SADC member states and international developing best practice. So some states will have some gaps that they might identify in their own legislation. Others may have fewer gaps. That will be a contextualization exercise, and in reporting implementation to the forum, each jurisdiction will identify where action was not necessary for transposition purposes because it was already taken account of in constitutional or other legislative arrangements of each member state. So the point made is well taken, and it is accepted that this will be a particular contextualization exercise.
Many thanks, Mr. Greenberg. Colleagues, we are now in the plenary part of our deliberations, so please do feel free to raise your hand and unmute your mic, and we look forward to any inputs that you have, or use the chat if you would prefer. Alternatively, emailed written inputs are also welcomed. I see Mr. Kalonzo's put his video on. Would you like to come in, Mr. Honourable MP Kalonzo?
Thank you so much. It's such an honor and a pleasure to be here, coming from the regional parliament where we have been debating ourselves the need for an act to manage the resources of the community. Because we don't have one yet, even though at the partner states level, they all have their assets, manage the public finances. But indeed, at a regional level, we do have several gaps. So it's very exciting to be here and interact with all of you. And just see how the RECs operate. Of course, I did have challenges contextualizing, but I'm glad Mr. Daniel was able to clarify. And it was just an issue of where the East Africa community, for the most part, has powers to legislate. And once the law is assented to by partner states, then it is binding to all of them. So, of course, we would have having gone through the bill before the clarifications, I was concerned where I referred to maybe ministers and what have you. But at a regional level, that would be drafting a matter of sovereignty, which we have not become a federation yet, and we may therefore not be able to legislate on matters that touch sovereignty issues of partner states. But I'm happy to be here. I'm definitely learning a lot. And we also hope you'd come to support us in drafting our own regional law. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Kalonzo, for those inputs. I do see a hand from Warren Mwambazi. So over to you, Warren. Thank you. You're currently muted. Are you able to unmute, Warren Mwambazi? You can unmute in the bottom left corner of your screen. I think Warren may have audio challenges currently. If Warren Mwambazi would like to pose a question in the chat, we will look out for that if you can't connect via audio. Anyone else whilst we wait for Warren and Mwambazi to make an input on any particular clause or aspect of the model law? I still see Mr. Mwambazi has his hand up, but either there's audio or there's a decision not to make an oral input. If you'd like to use the chat, please do feel free. Thank you. I see a hand from Brian Dube. Over to you.
Yes, thank you much more, and I want to thank Doc for a wonderful presentation. I hope I'm audible. Am I audible? Thank you. I think the model law is the best practice that the SADC region can come up with to prevent illicit financial flows, as well as to standardize the areas of oversight. We must understand that development is generated to a human right. So the people of SADC have a right to development, and the right to development can only be guaranteed through a standard within the region on how to protect public resources from member states, as well as also how on standard we can also punish those that are responsible for serious violations of good practice. I'm impressed actually by the draft model law presented, because to me, it gives a serious opportunity to SADC, and SADC member states have two options. Those that already do not have PFM laws, they can just adopt this as a law for themselves, and those that already have some PFM laws but which are inadequate may actually then also amend or review their laws to make sure that they incorporate the new standards and the modernization that is coming with the model law. This is my view. I'm actually very impressed with the initiative, and I hope SADC states actually adopt this model law and will move forward and actually pursue development as a human rights in the region. Thank you.
Many thanks, Honourable MP Brian Dube, for your oral as well as written inputs in the chat. Mr. Greenberg, any responses to that?
Apart from wishing to express on behalf not only of myself, but if I may, on behalf of the Technical Working Group, great appreciation for the support offered by the Honourable Brian Dubé in his remarks, which are enormously appreciated. I would, if I may, respectfully highlight the link that he adumbrates between human rights and public financial management, which, if I may say so, is not a link that is universally appreciated. And he will note that the model law draws particular attention to the concept of real participation and not merely passive transparency and accountability. And in two key places in the model law, there are administrative law duties placed upon public officials to engage actively with stakeholders from the public who wish to participate, so that proprietary issues in relation to human rights, property issues, as well as broader human rights perspectives, including equality and diversity, to which I referred in its own separate clause in relation to budget documentation, can all be brought to the attention, if necessary, of the courts through enforceable administrative law duties. So I respectfully adopt the link that he draws between human rights and the Public Financial Management Act, and if he or any other distinguished delegate identify ways in which that link could and should be further elucidated in the draft itself, we will be enormously grateful for any such indications.
Thank you, Mr. Greenberg. We continue to stream live on YouTube. You are welcome to make inputs in the chat or to raise your hand using the reaction function in the bottom right-hand corner of the Zoom platform to pose any questions or to make a remark. Now is an opportunity to give inputs. I'm also keeping an eye on the chat in case there are additions there. If you would prefer to consider the draft in its current form at your leisure and then submit recommendations via email, you are welcome to do that. But please do so shortly. We are working to quite stringent time frames. It's now 11:45. We had set aside until just after 1 for any deliberations. So we do have some time on our hands. I do not see any further comments in the chat or any hands raised currently. If you don't know how to use the reaction function, which is on the bottom of the screen, but you can unmute, please do. Now is a chance to make an input if you would like to do so. Chanel van der Berg, I see your hand, followed by Brian Dubé. Chanel van der Berg, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairperson and presenters, for this important workshop. I'm from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So I would just like to also support what Dr. Greenberg acknowledged and what Honorable Brian Doobie had said about the relation of human rights, the right to development, the SDGs in general, which is a human rights-based agenda, essentially. And I think this model law, which I still need to peruse in detail with a human rights-based economist, implicates human rights in two senses. Of course, as we all know, illicit financial flows detract from the resources necessary for social spending. But at the same time, when we speak about debt servicing and fiscal consolidation, it also has serious implication for the achievement of other international commitments, being, more legal commitments in terms of international human rights treaties, as opposed to greater voluntary commitments in terms of Agenda 2030. And as we keep seeing, and we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic as well, is that we need that fiscal space to develop a people-centered economy and a human rights-centered economy. So we need to also be able to show states, if they are to adopt these laws and best practice, how social spending can actually, in the medium and long term, open up that fiscal space needed for real, truly sustainable development. Because as Honorable Dubia would also know, the right to development is an amalgamation of all the rights, and we can't advance on one right, for example, the civil and political right to close out maladministration, corruption, and IFFs without simultaneously making progress or not regressing on any other right. So it is a very holistic view that we need to take. And just to note that even when we address debt servicing, we just also always have to think of how to open up fiscal space for rights realization, which will, by implication, also lead to sustainable development outcomes. Over for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chanel van den Berg, for the UN Human Rights Office. Fantastic inputs there. Daniel, any responses from your end?
I have nothing to add to those comments, with which I respectfully concur completely.
Thank you, Chanel. Thank you, Daniel. If the UNHCR are in a position to give written inputs, those would be welcome received by the technical working group. Any other hands? Now is your time. Please feel free. Thank you. I see Warren Mwambazi has put his hand up again. I hope your audio is in order. Unmute and please, let's hear from you. Yeah, we still can't hear you, unfortunately, Warren. I don't know if ICT colleagues at the SADC-PF can unmute Warren Mwambazi's microphone to see if we can hear him. Otherwise, please use the chat. I see colleagues trying to assist. Let's see if we can overcome these technical issues. We can see you, we just can't hear you. The mute function will be found in the bottom left of your screen. Oh, we can't hear you, unfortunately. Would you like to try and pose your question or remark in the chat function? So if you go to the bottom of your screen, near the center, there is a chat icon. We can see you, we just can't hear you. I think just your audio is not enabled or working, Warren. Whilst we wait for Warren to come on board, I see a hand from Honorable Brian Dube.
Thank you very much, moderator. My view is actually that the appreciation of the public finance management model law must be based on the understanding that all other rights actually are dependent on availability of resources. You would note that the right to education is limited on availability of resources, right to water, availability of resources, right to shelter on availability of resources, and environmental rights, every other right. So therefore, as a means and a commitment, demonstration of commitment by SADC, SADC must come up with an adoption of a law of this nature so as to guarantee the enjoyment of all these other existing rights, because all these other existing rights are dependent on this right to development. When people develop, their hospitals will be there, their schools will be there, their roads will be there, their houses will be there. So that's how important public finance management model law is for SADC, because that's where the foundation and the fundamentals for the enjoyment, fulfillment, and the protection of all other existing rights are dependent on. I hope it's appreciated, moderator, that this is the foundation for all other human rights.
Thank you, Honourable. Indeed, I heard you loud and clearly there, an encouragement to the SADC-PF and to member states to understand and appreciate the link between resourcing and the realization of rights. And thank you for your encouragement to others. I'm going to ask Warren if we can try use the chat to pose his question, because I can clearly see he'd like to engage us. Whilst we wait for his input, anyone else? Going to just suggest to Warren that he email his question to me, and I can then put it in the chat if he also doesn't have the access to the chat function due to the device challenges he's experiencing. We are in the part of the session where we are inviting inputs from persons. We earlier had a presentation on the SADC model law from Mr. Daniel Greenberg, who is the legal drafter, working with the technical working group established by the SADC Parliamentary Forum to develop this model law. There's been a series of consultations over the past few weeks and months with a range of stakeholders who have an interest in the model law. Today's session, of course, involves donor agencies, the IMF, World Bank, and regional and inter-parliamentary bodies and other agencies. You are welcome to give an oral input or use the chat, or to submit an email with feedback on the provisions of the draft model law. Would anyone else like to unmute and make themselves heard? I'm not seeing any more hands. I don't want to keep colleagues too long if there aren't any additional inputs. I see Warren has his hand up. He was off mute momentarily, so there seems to be progress there. Warren, would you like to come on board? Try again. We saw you unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me now. I'm Honorable Warren Chishamwambazi. I'm a chairperson for PAC in Zambia, and also the chairperson for SADC-PAC. Thank you so much, Mr. Greenberg. I think the model law on public financial management has got a lot of insights. What I just wanted to find out is how we're able to harmonize the especially issue of public debt management in a SADC region, as well as issues pertaining to IFF, which is illicit financial flows. How is a model coming in to ensure that member states can, before they even domesticate that, they harmonize? Because if you look at public debt management, we've got different ways the member states are managing public debt, and we are all struggling with issues of public debt management. Some countries, it passes through Parliament, and Parliament has to authorize and also come up with ceilings. And other countries, such things don't happen. It's just a finance minister. They go and borrow and come and say, this is what we've done. And you find that debt is not collaborating with the investments which some of these jurisdictions or countries are coming up with. So how does the model on public financial management comes in to mitigate some of these issues? I think that's what I wanted to contribute. Thank you.
Mr. Greenberg, thoughts in response?
Yes, thank you for that. And thank you for that series of observations. I completely agree, if I may, that in relation to debt management, the tension between harmonization, standardization, and local contextualization is as extreme as anywhere else in the draft model law. And I draw the distinguished delegate's attention to a provision that I did mention as I went through the model law at the beginning of Part 8 on government borrowing, and that is classification of public debt in Clause 72, because the core requirement for harmonization is that all states agree that they all understand that they're talking about the same thing. And one of the difficulties in relation to discussions about government debt control and management is precisely that there are different understandings, as the distinguished delegate observed, as to what counts as debt. And the classification exercise, which, as I said in my remarks earlier, is designed to catch anything that imposes an actual or contingent financial liability on the state, is the first process towards a harmonization, because it means that the conversation being had in all member states is based on an equal understanding of what government debt is. After that, the processes, the strategy, the committees, the processes can be harmonized. And yes, to some extent, that requires to feed into a coherence for international stakeholders and partners, a coherence that they can then observe across all the states that have implemented the model law. But again, yes, political considerations come back in and will require contextualization in particular jurisdictions. So I completely accept the premise of the question that balancing harmonization and standardization with effective local transposition and domestication is particularly challenging in relation to debt management. I think the model law shows the core planks on which we think that balance can rest. But again, if the distinguished delegate or others have written observations as to how that might be nuanced and evolved, I will be particularly grateful and I will look at them with great care.
Thank you, Mr. Greenberg. Thank you, Warren Wambazi, for that observations and inputs there. Well done on overcoming those technical challenges that we encountered a bit earlier. Again, like we said, just if you would like to have some time to go through the various provisions, we welcome written inputs to inform the drafting process. It's now just after 12 o'clock and in Central Africa time. And are there any other inputs? I did see the Secretary General come on screen a bit momentarily earlier. I just wanted to see if there are any other remaining inputs and whether, if they aren't, if the Secretary General would like to make any remarks at this stage. Our thanks to the SADC-PF for holding and managing this process, providing the leadership.
Thank you very much, Kay and Dr. Greenberg and participants who have come on board today for this important session. I would also just like to make a few observations based on the questions that have been flighted this morning. That as UN partners, we look up to you to assist us develop an architecture that can take forward the model law in terms of informing members of parliament or the institution of parliament foremost and stakeholders. I would not go back to what has already been reiterated in terms of the threat to not having a robust PFM system. And I would like to encourage you to partner with the SADC Parliamentary Forum. We see a lot of good work that has been done, particularly by the UN financing project, which is doing capacity development sessions to simply continuously monitor and measure and map and compare financial flows as one instance. And we see an opportunity that can also be presented to see how we strengthen committees of parliament, stakeholders in the civil society organization to deal with these complex issues beyond the adoption of the model law. There are critical issues that we would like to focus on going forward. We've had a few requests from our stakeholders who have consulted in this session of the consultation process, who are calling out for capacity development. And measurement is one of the key issues that we would like to partner with you on so that we can access funding to facilitate the institution of parliament and other stakeholders. We also want to look forward to engaging with you on how we develop guidelines. Where are the guidelines that you already have? How do we test and pilot them in a manner that can assist members of parliament? What is required in order for us to engage with you and do so? But ultimately, let me conclude by just saying that we are confident that your presence here today indicates your appreciation. If you didn't have an appreciation, I believe that you fully appreciate the merits of the model law and will come together for further collaborative efforts. We'll also need you as we disseminate the model law and come up with strategies to be able to do so. We have tried, and you've heard from the drafter and participants who've been with us for some time, that we sought to address several ills on the social and economic landscape through the sacrosanct oversight function of parliaments. And this has a huge potential to enable change. We also recognize that we can only do that through partnerships. We can unleash this partnership together as stakeholders. We can unite to make an advancement in public financial management normative frameworks. Capacity development, measurement leads to good governance and democratic change. I thank you and wish you a good afternoon.
Thank you, SG, for those remarks and responses. I do see that Mr. Warren Mwambazi has made another remark in the chat. So just drawing colleagues' attention to that. He says, I'm also interested in public debt management and bonding of sovereign wealth and how the model law on PFM can address or mitigate these issues in the SADC region. We would welcome your consideration of Part 8 of the model law. If you feel there are gaps or areas where it could be elaborated on further with those observations in mind, please drop us an email on those aspects if you feel there could be additional clauses or strengthening there.
If you allow me, apologies, okay, just to invite stakeholders, we have a committee sitting from the 27th of April until the 4th of April. But the model law is going to be read clause by clause on the 28th and 29th of April. If you would like to attend this session where members of parliament in the region are going to be validating the model law, they will ask questions, they will need input from citizens of SADC, kindly write to the SADC-PF. The same email that invited you will share a link with you to join the proceedings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable SG. I did receive a notification yesterday that Mr. Hugo Koshima from the IMF would be joining a bit later because of time differences. I do see him on the call. Thank you for joining, and apologies for the time variations there. If there are any inputs, any further inputs, we're nearing the conclusion of our consultative meeting, considering the inputs to date. One last call. Would anyone like to make any inputs? You can unmute or use the chat. And last call. I see, Mr. Koshima, you put your video on. Thank you for connecting with us in the early morning there. If you'd like to make any inputs, you are welcome to at this stage, but you don't have to, but the floor is yours if you would like to.
Thank you. Yeah, indeed, I prepare some very short presentations for today's meeting. I apologize, I joined a little bit late. I'm on the other side of the planet. But if I may, if you can give me like 10-15 minutes, I can share my thoughts on these documents. Would that be okay?
I see the SG nodding. I would certainly welcome them. If the ICT team can provide Mr. Koshima with hosting capacity so that he can share his screen.
Indeed, he is able to share.
I think it's working, yeah. Okay, thank you very much. And then good afternoon to all the participants, Honorable Chair. I'm Hugo Koshima from the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. I'm currently the economist at the IMF, but previously I was the lawyer at the IMF legal department. And with that capacity, I was involved in reform of the PFM law in several countries in the regions, including like East African communities, recently the Rwandas, and a few years ago in Tanzania, Zanzibar, Eswatini, the Lesotho, some West African countries, etc. So basically, I just wanted to share some of my thoughts on this very exciting exercise. But just to give some structure to my feedback, basically, I wanted to first kind of share with you some of my thinking about kind of like a good practices or the principles for the drafting of the PFM law, which basically IMF kind of typically advise to the countries when we are involved in this kind of capacity development exercise. So the principles includes, I'm sure you may have heard of it, like a comprehensiveness, the good reform ambitions, and the consistency with other laws, and then some other issues here. So as I mentioned, basically the PFM law is typically recommended to be comprehensive. Like a long time ago, like a decades ago, this kind of law had a very narrow focus on particular issues in the budget process or maybe the cash management. But now it is recommended to be sort of comprehensive enough to cover all the PFM areas. And also, as I'm going to explain later, this document will survive for a long time, typically. So it's important to have a kind of medium to long-term reform ambitions because this document can survive for a long time. But the reform ambition needs to be kind of at the right level. So if it is overly ambitious, then we may not be able to implement these documents. And then, I mean, at the end, the PFM law is just a part of the broader legal framework of the country. So it needs to be consistent with other laws existing in this country. So just to kind of support my point, so in terms of the comprehensiveness, I just throw kind of bunch of this kind of law in other countries in the region. I say this is the southern side, this is the eastern side, and this is the western side, and we have a little bit of francophone as well. But as you can see, this kind of new, relatively new PFM law tends to have a lot of greens. So green means like these issues like macro fiscal, budget preparation, budget execution, debt and cash management, accounting, reporting, kind of fully captured. While if it is like a yellow, that means some elements are missing. And if it is like a red, it's not captured. There are some exceptions, but it's kind of like becoming quite common for the PFM law to cover all these issues. So a country like Eswatini in the region, it's very comprehensive coverage. And many East African countries, like Kenya, Uganda, also has a very comprehensive coverage. And Tanzania happen to have like half of the coverage since they happen to have another law that covers these issues. But that's a little bit different approach. And also, when we think about the comprehensiveness, it's important to think about the institutional coverage as well. So basically, to which institutions this law applies. And sorry for this abbreviations, but BCG means the budgetary central government. I'm using the terminologies under the government finance statistics. And so it's basically like entities included in the budgets. And there's no problem capturing these entities in any countries. But problems start to happen in terms of this extra budgetary fund or extra budgetary entities. Which may receive some money from the budgets, like a transfer or something like that. But they have sort of their own independence or freedom to determine the expenditure allocations. And they don't really they are not fully appropriated by the parliament. Sometimes this entity is called subvented agencies or public entities or different name is given to these entities. But if it comes to these entities, also PFM law is supposed to capture these entities, since these entities are a little bit kind of unique and kind of difficult to capture legally, because we kind of need to work on the definitions very nicely. So many countries ended up missing a lot of elements. So if country is yellow, that means some of these entities captured, but not all entities captured. Some entities missing for, in many cases, the technical reason. So this is something we may want to be careful. And the local government, as you can see, the majority of in the majority of countries, the PFM law does not really capture the local governments. So in case of South Africa, they have the Municipal Financial Management Act. And I think Zambia also has other law. Uganda also has other law. And a place like Sierra Leone or a little bit of Tanzania, they have like a 1 or 2 article that kind of request the reporting from the local government to the central government, but the bulk of the issue is covered by, say, like a local government finance act or similar documents. So this is more like outside of the typical scope of the PFM law. And the lastly, not least, the public corporations, or sometimes we call it the state-owned enterprise, is a very important element of the PFM law. Also, particularly some old law does not really cover this entity. But it's important to have some law that capture the state-owned enterprise. So if PFM law does not cover the state-owned enterprise, then we need to have, some law like, the Public Corporation Law or State-Owned Enterprise Act to make sure that we establish the so-called financial oversight of these entities. Sorry. So that was a little bit of my background. So I have had a chance to take a look at the draft model PFM law, and I have some observations in terms of the comprehensiveness. So draft model PFM law covers a lot of PFM areas, so it's quite comprehensive, but there are some exceptions to that, if I understand correctly. So for example, usually a lot of countries, as you can see, has a chapter on macro fiscal policy or fiscal policy making, or the kind of chapter. And that chapter usually talks about the process before the budget preparation. So nowadays, it's important to have a top-down budget process where the first people decide the amount of the revenue, and then amount of the deficit that they can finance. And then they go to the expenditure allocations. In all the good days, things goes vice versa. People first start talk about the needs and then determine how much they want. And then they start to think about, do we have this revenue, or can we borrow this amount? But we want to make things vice versa. So it's important to have some chapter that talks about the top-down budget process. So basically, we typically want to introduce some fiscal strategy documents, or the budget framework paper, whatever name it is, some kind of document that set out overall resource envelope. And this envelope will be discussed at the Parliament, ideally. And then after that, each agency start preparing, these the budget submissions, basically. But that part, I couldn't find that part in the model PFM law. And also, it's important to talk about the budget execution issues, in particular the commitment controls. I understand that some country like South Africa may have kind of moved away from this kind of issues, because for them, there is a very big capital market, so access to the cash is not a problem. It's another issue whether their debt is sustainable, but access to the cash is not a problem in this big country. But we have also like a very small countries, or a country with capacity constraint among our membership. And then these countries, say like, for example, Eswatini or Lesotho or the kind of place, the commitment control is probably more important than the budget preparation or like a fiscal policy making. This is really like a fundamental arrangement to prevent the accumulation of the payment areas. But I couldn't really find this one in the model PFM law. So this is something we could address. And the same as the cash management, particularly like establishment of the treasury single account. Again, this is not a big issue in a big country, but this is like a fundamental issue in a sort of country with relatively less developed PFM system. So in particular, it's important for the PFM law to define and require the TSA, because otherwise we will never have this arrangement to consolidate all the cash balances and to prevent some idling cash from sitting somewhere while the country is borrowing large money. So that's another sort of the issues that could be addressed. And in terms of the entities, first, maybe we could strengthen or clarify the financial controls over the extra budgetary public authorities. I noticed that the model law used the term public authorities, which may be similar to the public entities under the PFM Act of the South Africa, which is kind of mixture of the budgeted ministries and also some other agencies, commissions, and that kind of entities. But usually this kind of entities has its own board of directors, which determines the budgets, and then approve the financial statements and does that kind of things. But it's important for the Ministry of Finance to have some control or some kind of the monitoring of the financial affairs of these extra budgetary entities, because at the end these entities take a lot of money from the budgets. While it often happens that these guys enjoy the freedom, and many people don't know what these entities are doing. So this aspect could be clarified. While as I looked at in the previous slide, not many countries include the state governments or local authorities in the PFM law, simply because the intergovernmental fiscal relations are quite different across the countries. So I guess in case of Tanzania, for example, yeah, they do have a state government called the Zanzibar, which is kind of autonomous area of the United Republic of Tanzania. But that place is like almost like a federalism sort of like arrangement. So basically the law of the sort of like the United Republic, so like a federal government, does not apply to the Zanzibar if it comes to the PFM issue. So basically PFM law of the mainland Tanzania does not have a jurisdiction over the state government. So I'm not sure we can include these elements in the PFM law. The same as the local authorities. For example, in case of South Africa, as long as I understand, the municipalities are very independent fiscally. And in that case, it's probably better to have a separate law, because the lawmaking process for this kind of like very autonomous local authorities, probably different from the ordinary law of the central government, because we need to have a different stakeholder consultation process, or sometimes even the parliament has the different committees to talk about local government issues. So, my suggestion is maybe we could make these state government and local authorities like optional, and so country can choose. And lastly, not least, I noticed that there's a chapter on a state enterprise. It's a very important chapter, and then I'm glad to see that chapter in the model PFM law. But I think we could beef up the contents a little bit. Currently, it is focusing on the definition of these entities, which is important. But at the end, the financial oversight of these entities is really the core. So we kind of need to talk about who approves the budgets, and then what is the role of the central agency, like the Ministry of Finance, and who receive the financial statements, and what kind of measure the central government can take when these entities start to have the financial problem. So that's my comment on the comprehensiveness. That's actually the bulk of the comments. But if I may, I could also mention a little bit about the reform ambitions. So basically, it's important for the PFM law to include the medium to long-term reform goals or reform agendas, because the PFM law tends to survive for a long period. So the previous South African law survived for 24 years, and the existing one was approved in 1999. So it's almost the same time, like a quarter century. And the previous law in Lesotho also survived for 23 years, and the new one is like 10 years old. Some countries replaced the PFM law a little bit earlier, like 15 years. Some countries much earlier, but if you replace the PFM law like in 3 years, like CEMAC did in 2011, maybe they didn't implement this old law, so they are a little bit wasting their time. But generally, the PFM law survives like 15 to 25 years, so we need to kind of look for the future. But also, this kind of reforms has to be feasible depending on the level of the capacity. We cannot require something that is not possible. So this is just an illustration of the South African Municipal Finance Management Law, and they have a very nice this table, which sort of differentiate the time when this law is implemented across this municipality with high capacity, medium capacity, low capacity. But as you can see, the low capacity entities require a lot more time to implement this kind of law. And same things happen at the national level. So feasibility is another important aspect to think about. And also, when we approve this kind of law, people tempted to carry over the provisions from the old law because people are really affectionated to the provisions in the old law. So this is some extreme example, but when the Sierra Leone approved the financial management regulations in 2007, actually the 3/4 of this document is just a carryover from the old regulations, probably going back to the colonial time. And none of this is even relevant to the current environment. I'm always joking about this, but there's some article that talks about the color of pen when you keep the book. Because the green pen is reserved to the auditors. So we have to use the different color of pen when we keep the book. But we don't use the notebook anymore to keep the book. We use the IFMIS, the computers. So those articles are useless. So we need to eliminate this kind of existing and outdated sort of provisions when we have the new law. So in case of draft model PFM law, it is really forward-looking. It has a lot of good reform agendas, but there are some requirements which, in my view, may be very difficult to implement in countries with a capacity constraint. I have visited quite a few your membership countries, so I know that some of the countries have a very limited capacity. For example, Lesotho, Eswatini, Tanzania a little bit, Zanzibar, some other place. So, for example, there are like a series of the documentation requirement, something about this kind of performance-based information. So there's an article on the development objective, sustainable policy, SDG, some other international commitments, and equality, diversity. I mean, of course, these are the very important concepts. The SDG is very important. The equality, diversity, it's crucial. But if we look at these sections, there's nothing but just a documentation of these some policy agendas or evaluation of these policy. But at the end, producing this kind of documents kind of require a lot of capacity, but some, of the countries that we have only like 2-3 people in the budget department who are kind of juggling so many different things. So I think it's good to make sure that this kind of like a documentation requirement is feasible across all the membership countries. And maybe we can increase a little bit of flexibility so that the country can choose what kind of documents they want to produce. And also, interestingly, also the draft model law generally eliminates all the sort of outdated practices. There are 2 parts, part 4 and part 5, which look really like a law of the 1950s. I saw these things a lot in the PFM law of the colonial time. But part 4, public funds. And it's interesting that this law kind of starts with the fund before they go to the budgets and other issues. That was really like a classic sort of arrangement of the PFM law. But we are kind of moving away from this cash-oriented sort of approach. We want to start from the macro fiscal, coming on to the budgets, and then go to the execution, and then finally we reach the cash. So, and then in this part, basically, there are a lot of articles on like a trading account, which is an extra budgetary arrangement with some kind of free access to the resources. It's a very bad arrangement. And some membership countries struggling with this entity. So we don't want to endorse such arrangement. And there's a sections on the retention funds or something, retention accounts. But but the retention account goes against the idea of the TSA. Many countries struggle to get rid of those arrangements. So we don't want to endorse those practices. And then part 5 has it's mainly focusing on the appropriation EI. But that was also like some bad practice to sort of like accommodate sort of a lot of external grants. So basically, when the country doesn't want to budget the external grants, they use the appropriation EI. But that is not really a good practice. So I think this is some kind of legacy of the past. And then we kind of sort of ended up just carrying over this kind of old provision. So it's good to revisit these old articles and then clean it up. And the consistency with other laws. So, I mean, of course, this is the model law. So, we cannot really assess the consistency with the other laws in the particular countries. But there are some chapters that are likely to, create overlap with other laws. So there are some unusual contents in this the model PFM law. So, for example, part 6, the parliamentary controls, which is predominantly about the audit issues. And of course, audit is really important, including the roles of the PAC committees. But I think most of the membership countries has the audit law or some kind of law on the auditor general or something like that. So if we include this part in the PFM law, we will create a conflict with the audit law.
Discutir neste fórum, devemos criar uma
countries struggle to establish this law. And then we have like a series of the international standards to talk about this audit law. So there are a lot of considerations given to these documents. So we usually don't want to create overlap with the audit law because it's such a sensitive document. And same as the procurement, usually most of the countries, except probably for the South Africa, has the public procurement law. And then this is sort of like a self-contained area. Also, it's highly related to the PFM because this one applies to both public and private sector. So since we already have another law, probably it's it might create the conflict with other law if we include this part in a PFM law. So maybe we could include more like a reference to the public procurement law to address the procurement issues. And also, there's an interesting part on the cryptocurrencies. I must admit, I know nothing about the cryptocurrencies, but intuitively, I think this is more related to the central bank or some kind of financial regulators, because we want to regulate this kind of electronic currencies. So if we include this in the PFM law, maybe we might create some overlap with the financial regulations created by the central bank. And also similarly, I see some enforcement powers of the parliament to address some corruptions or misconduct. Of course, the enforcement power is very important, but it's a little bit unusual for the parliament to exercise such like a law enforcement role. Because first, parliament is a lawmaker rather than a law enforcement. And also, this kind of law enforcement powers may create a conflict with powers of the independent entities. Basically, a lot of countries created the independent entities in order to make sure that these law enforcement powers are exercised by the independent entities. So we don't want to probably create a conflict. So one thing is, for example, Section 113 allow the parliament to dismiss the public official by the resolutions. But that is typically the role of the public service commissions, because we want the independent agency to sort of assess, these needs of the dismissal. It's kind of like a judicial entities. And also I see the section 14 on the complaints portal, where the citizen submits some complaints to the parliament, and the parliament issues some orders that will override or bind the governments. But I think that is typically the role of the anti-corruption commissions. They are the ones who take this kind of complaints and then exercise the powers. So anyway, at the end, it depends on the countries in terms of the institutional arrangement. But we don't want to probably create a conflict with this kind of independent agencies. I'm almost done. So there are two other issues which are still very important, but this didn't fit in the other slide. So first, I see the 60% of GDP debt ceiling. Generally, it is a good practice to be very transparent about the long-term fiscal policy, and having the fiscal rule is the one way to do that. But my concern is that the membership countries have a very sort of a different sort of fiscal status. So 60% works well for some countries, but for other countries, maybe this is too high, or maybe this is not consistent with fiscal policy they are doing. So basically, we need to really tailor, this kind of like a level of the fiscal rules or objective to each individual countries, and we have to do a lot of mathematics. So unless we have the common currency or something like that, probably it would be better to include procedural rules rather than to set out some specific numbers in the law, because it's very difficult to come up with the numbers that universally applicable to all the membership countries. So that's one suggestion here. And also, these are microscopic issues, but the controls of the government on lending and the guarantees could be strengthened. The model law is very open, so that even the government can lend money to the commercial banks, so that they can pass on this money to other entities. But this kind of practice is useful for the advanced economies or big countries, maybe South Africa, I don't know. But for the small countries, this kind of on lending is like very prone to abuse. I see in other countries where there's a long list of the on lending given like 30, 40 years ago, and none of this has been paid back. So this is like a disguised like expense. So we really want to be tough on this item. And same as the guarantees, I see some sections that say government can guarantee the government, but that sounds like a self-guaranteeing. So Ministry of Finance is guaranteeing on the claim of the government, but Ministry of Finance is part of the government. So that probably doesn't work very well usually. And guarantees are, kind of like prone to the abuse. So I see in other countries where the Ministry of Finance guaranteeing the areas of the other ministries, but first, it doesn't make sense. And then second, basically this kind of like guarantees are sort of like used as some kind of IOU for other ministries to get something from the suppliers. So basically we need to tighten the controls over this kind of arrangement. And this is just my question. So this is all what I have. So thank you very much for listening, and thank you very much for this opportunity. And I'm very happy to be present today. So thank you. So I stop here.
Thank you, Mr. Kushima. Please, could you kindly share your PowerPoint presentation with the technical working group, so that we can look into some of those aspects, areas that you've made recommendations on. We'd also welcome actual text on some of the clauses where you feel it could be strengthened. Daniel, would you like to provide some responses, please?
I can give a very quick couple of responses, and we would be grateful for submissions, but the distinguished delegate will need obviously to refine his remarks. I mean, for example, Section 113 has nothing to do with dismissal. It's about disqualification. So there is some serious refinement to be done, and then we'll be enormously grateful. Macro fiscal policy is dealt with in Clause 59 and will partly be dealt with, of course, by administrative action prior to the budget submissions. Budget execution is dealt with by a combination of administrative undertakings and throughout the bill at various levels. Cash management is dealt with in Part 4, and the various accounts were specifically required by different member states to reflect their particular financial arrangements. It's very important, as was said earlier before the distinguished delegate so kindly joined us, that we have to contextualize in local areas as well as providing overarching standardization and harmonization. The inclusion of state-owned enterprises has been specifically requested by a number of member states and the technical working group. But of course, we are perfectly well aware that they need to have separate approaches, which is why Schedules 1 to 3 provide for modification. The same goes for the comments on local authorities. Yes, of course, local authorities have different arrangements, hence the modifications in Schedules 1 to 3. The suggestion that parts 4 to 5 are a colonial legacy based on the 1950s inheritance is simply, I with enormous respect, reject that. I was the author of the 2005 United Kingdom arrangements for the public financial management. That is in no way, that's not a very long time ago, and it's nothing to do with the 1950s. And we structured it very similarly for reasons of readability and accessibility that were discussed with a large number of readerships around the world in a variety of contexts. Cash accounting and resource accounting, the distinguished delegate would have heard me talking about resource accounts and the focus on resource accounts and whole of government accounts before, and that is indeed a core part of parts 4 and 5. Trading accounts, again, specifically asked for precisely the reason the delegate gives, that we have to contain them within the envelope of overall scrutiny in order to ensure they do not undermine the fundamental arrangements. Similarly, for the what was described as bad practice in Part 5, again, it's designed to bring things within the control of the overarching principles. Overlap with other laws, yes, of course, we know that. We've discussed that on this occasion earlier in this forum and on many other occasions, and that's a core part of the contextualization and transposition domestication process, which will avoid conflict. And different jurisdictions will make their own decisions about the balance where they put audit, whether they have it in other laws, whether they have in this law. The cryptocurrency provisions are not addressed by way of regulation to the central bank. They expressly do not do that. They are addressed to oversight of the central bank regulatory functions as set out in Part 12. Section 113, as I've said, is nothing to do with dismissal, it's about disqualification. And I've already mentioned the separation of powers that the distinguished delegate would have heard us discuss earlier on in the session. And finally, on lending, yes, again, that is something which is capable of being misused. We're very well aware of that, which is precisely why we want to make provision for it to bring it within the envelope. So I thank the distinguished delegate for his enormously important and valuable observations. I look forward very much to seeing them in writing, and I hope that he will refine them to address the specifics of the model law as set out in my remarks just now before he very kindly submits them. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mr. Greenberg and Mr. Koshima. I do see Honourable Brian Dube has provided some feedback in the chat on the Public Accounts Committee. He's given his experience there and in relation to the concerns of overlap with commissions and his views there. Thank you for sharing those. I do think we are about to conclude. Thank you, everyone, for your attention this morning and for your inputs. Again, as we said earlier, we welcome written inputs over email. Thank you to the SADC Parliamentary Forum for creating this process and this mechanism through which we can develop this collaboratively and move forward to support hopeful adoption and of course that member states really do reflect on their existing regulatory frameworks and see where these can be strengthened. Thank you to the aid donor agencies, the IMF, the World Bank, and others for their attention and involvement today. Thank you to the keynote speaker for his address, Mr. Sunderland from SEDA. Sincere thanks to you for setting aside the time to share those. There's one final message in the group, in the chat I just wanted to see. And that's directed to me, that's in order. Honourable Secretary General, would you like to have the final words?
Thank you very much, Kay. I thought I had my final words, but just to encourage the presenter to share with us his contribution, and we would look at it as you've already indicated, and that we believe that the focus of the model law as presented, especially as it relates to parliamentary oversight, was really to address the gaps that have been there and the needs to empower, the Public Accounts Committee, respecting the separation of powers. So I believe that that should be underlined, because that conflict should not be seen to be introduced by the Public Financial Model Law. So we're looking forward to his comments, and he could also engage further with Dr. Greenberg for context and other issues in the technical working group. So we'll share the email so that we benefit from Fukushima. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. This concludes this consultative meeting. Have a good afternoon or morning.
Thank you, Kay.
Thank you.